Good. Oh, good evening, everyone. Obviously, we're doing Therapy of Desire again, chapter 8 now. This chapter is called Skeptic Purgatives, Disturbance and the Life Without Belief. And we were all just sort of having a bit of chat and naturally came around to the idea of something like what the skeptics are interested in, and this is sort of my summary of it in a couple of words. The skeptic approach seems to be one of critiquing beliefs and bracketing out beliefs in general, and trying to find a manner in which a person could live like that, which raises all sorts of questions and very interesting questions. I thought that the skeptics really grabbed my attention. This chapter, I just thought was really thought-provoking, and that their stance is a really viable one in my mind, and quite, I think, made the Epicurean tradition kind of look. It really pointed out the differences between them, and for me, the skeptical position seems like a stronger one. What did you guys think about that?
Well, look, it was really intriguing for me because I've always been what I would consider a lukewarm fence sitter on all things at all times. So it's been a more of a confusion creating thing for me rather than ataraxia. I don't think I have ever achieved ataraxia by my stance of finding it difficult to attach belief to a lot of stuff. It's given me more confusion, not anxiety, but confusion. And that's sort of across all things like, for example, politics, or for all manner of some scientific topics. And it's been, I just think that to achieve ataraxia, which is their goal, I just think it's a choice that you actually have to make. Like they talk about, you reach a point of acceptance of this not taking on board either argument, suspension of belief. But then there's no real necessarily reason why you would just suddenly reach ataraxia. But that was my feeling about it as I was reading it. What would force me or encourage me or motivate me to move towards ataraxia or to freedom from disturbance? That's all. And my only other comment was, I noticed very strongly through the piece, through the whole chapter, that she was really pushing that idea of the paradox, of the fact that you've got a way of viewing or interacting with the world which is in a way systemized by the skeptics, and yet their stance is against any idea of that sort of dogmatic or system of belief, yeah, anyway. Yeah.
So were the skeptics more, I don't know a lot about the skeptics, were they more in alignment with like the scientific modern, science principle of disproving things is what you're all about? What you're going to do is to try and disprove things, and the things you can't disprove skeptically, that's where I assume the word comes from, means that you end up with a truer place.
We'll get to a definition because it comes up in the first part, but basically they don't have any place for dogmatic belief whatsoever. So they're not even looking for truth, like in the normal scientific point of view. Right. They think that any belief that you have can be counterbalanced by any other competing opposite claim. So you might believe a person should vote for this guy, and then the skeptic will say, well, actually, you can come up with equal claims against that. So there's no It's not that there's not a truth, but we couldn't possibly work out what it is, seems to be the
Right.
position. And that's a waste of time trying. What do you think, Judith? What did you think of this book? I mean, this chapter?
Yeah, I thought it was really, really well done. And although I have done some thinking about, well, very limited amount of reading and thinking about the ancient skeptics, this was a very thorough look, I thought, and presented the ancient skeptic position in a very fair manner, almost, well, yeah, about as well as it could be presented, but also the objections to the ancient skeptical position were presented in a way that I think ultimately were pretty conclusive towards the end of the chapter, in concluding that that the hardline skeptical position isn't really coherent with anything like normal life, including normal relationships, and that's pretty key to a well-lived life. So yeah, but overall I thought it was very, very well done.
And it's amazing how clever the skeptics were, as Sextus or whoever was coming back with really intelligent responses to these sort of devastating critiques of skepticism, really. And you do get the feeling that he's playing word games a little bit, but I guess he can. This is the trouble with skepticism, because he doesn't have to say anything that he actually agrees with anyway. So it makes it like difficult to deal with.
Doesn't have to justify or explain anything. Right.
He does. He can use reason, but it's merely instrumental. He doesn't really have to follow the rules like other people do.
Yeah.
But I wanted to note a few things before we go on, because in more than any other chapter, probably, there was a few things that I flagged. So if I just say them rather than go into them, at least we can keep them in our mind. So like one thing I thought was skepticism's inability to provide a suitable way of caring for extended others seems like a really powerful critique against it, or for what happens to them. That's what you were just talking about, Judith. So that's one that I think is a real blow, ultimately. Another one would be, another blow. Can the skeptic really be undogmatic and not hold beliefs? I mean, I can see how they try and get out of it, but really? It just seems like they're moving the goalposts around a bit sometimes. Perhaps ataraxia manifests in relation as tolerance or patience, he says towards the end, and is required for a ground to good activity. So I took that as a really good thing. Like, in a sense, he says the tolerant person, the patient person, is sort of manifesting ataraxia. I thought that was a nice, makes it very achievable or possible for most people, and also grounds it as a way of going forward. Sorry. So another thing I noticed was that concern that operating from impulse may lead to bad habits. Yeah, I was worried that all this talk about following the natural impulse and the natural instinct, well, what if you've already got bad habits? You know, this is the kind of thing the other schools were interested in. They could come through society or through bad teaching. How then do you treat an addiction if you're not, before you know that it's a problem for you, you know? And another thing would be that I noticed, I thought this, I wonder what you guys think, that the skeptics are concerned about contradiction and putting opposition towards things. But I think the Stoics already understand this, and they go beyond contradiction also in their own way. And for example, they say that the preconceptions, the innate ideas of the good we have, cannot fall into contradiction with one another. So virtue can't contradict itself, basically. So I think that's just an interesting comparison, that obviously the Stoics, with belief, are able to resolve the contradiction problem. But let's jump into it. Did anyone have any points to add to that? Maybe you made some points of your own. Anybody noticed anything that they want to keep in mind as we go along?
So are you saying the skeptics, their underlying ground rule is more Rousseauian, in that a natural state is this state of ataraxia, or is it more like a are they more in line with like Ernest Becker, denial of death, like that a natural underlying state is extreme agitation and virtually psychotic fear, and does it take a position on that? Does it? Do you get it? Is there an implication from the skeptics as to what the natural state is? Or are they saying there's no natural base state for humans? Because you know how we've got those two competing sort of ideas, though, romanticist Rousseauian idea that Garden of Eden, natural state, and that's what we're all trying to deal with dealing with our mental health issues, as opposed to the idea that the underlying state, which I love that Ernest Becker book, Denial of Death, is that far. It's grim, and we just go through our lives manufacturing ways to avoid the awful truth that we're impermanent, highly vulnerable, and should really be really anxious and not happy most of the time. It appeals to some...
He does bring up the nature of animals a few times in the chapter, bringing it back to animal nature and the way animals would relate to the world in the way they perceive the world. Not that we really know how they perceive the world, but he does bring that up. Sextus does bring that up, doesn't he?
Right.
Yeah, so this model, and this is something that Nussbaum mentions several times in the chapter, as you say, Jody. Skeptics would recommend that we look to the attitude of non-human animals and playful or relaxed children as a model for the way to proceed. And so, at least in that sense, they were like the other schools in trying to make an argument from what's called a cradle argument. What really is the case with infants and young children. So they did share that with the other schools. This appeal to nature, if you like. Whether it was done convincingly or not, well, we'll have to see.
All right, we'll quickly jump in. So the first little summary here, I've just made a little note. It says, the other schools hold that we need beliefs to manage that we need beliefs to manage to go about our lives, basically. And having the right kind of beliefs is the goal, So we see that through Epicurus, the Stoics. But skepticism does not. It brackets out belief. It has no judgment that X is good or bad, and no commitment toward the idea that things are either way. So it just takes appearances as they are. Shannon, did you want to mention the thing about the boat?
Yeah, sure. So just read them up. I think it's just, just the second page, or from first to second. Well, she's got this thing where she's sort of talking about the fortress and the ship. And like I was saying online, I think this is sort of demonstrates one of the strengths and weaknesses of Nussbaum, where, it's got this bit, and it's pretty well written. She's not a bad writer. She's a very good writer compared to philosophers. This faint praise sort of thing. But it's well written, but it sort of muddles the point, because where she sort of, at least the way I would read it here in that first part, she's sort of getting to the point of that this is those two analogies, which is, it's all very she's running both of them at the same time. They sort of both have this same problem, and it feels like it would have just been easier if she had have just chosen one analogy to go on, or not used it. Oh, I guess it's a metaphor, not an analogy. But if she just chosen one metaphor and stuck with that, if she wants that pretty writing, and it is pretty. I'm not saying that sarcastically. That was my thought on that part.
Are you highly suspicious of the aesthetic principle by the sound of
No, it's just an aesthetic choice that she's made Sometimes she sort of, it feels like she sort of gets into this, like, I want to make, like, I want to do pretty writing. Like, I want to have a nice, like, it's nice imagery and stuff like that. And sometimes gets in the way, I think, of like understanding, okay, like, what do you actually mean? Like, what's the thread that I'm supposed to be following here as like the direction?
What's the agenda too? What's the
Yeah,
agenda? I'm making it pretty.
yeah. And especially to just having those two metaphors going at once. It sort of just makes it makes the writing more complicated than I feel it needs to be. And I just imagine someone reading this could find that as a barrier to understanding it. But yeah, what do other people think about it? About the section?
I sort of see a fortress and a ship as both artifacts of human engineering and know-how and expertise, something that's been constructed. So I didn't have a problem with the analogy of the fortress and the ship. I sort of it helped me a little, to be honest. It visualized for me something that I could understand quickly and easily from what I think what she was aiming us to see. Anyway, that was my feeling on it.
Yeah, and I felt like it neatly summarized the those positions in just a metaphor. So Aristotle's like, well, you know, knowledge is like a ship, and as you go along, you might find this plank will work better in this place, and you start replacing bits and pieces on the pursuit of building a better ship. But the fortress of Epicurus, you know, we immediately grasp the idea behind it, that it's cast in stone, that it's the kind of thing that doesn't get modified like a leaky ship might. And I just think it's a really neat way to quickly bring to mind the differences. What do you think, Judith?
Yeah, I agree, and I thought particularly the where she extends the marine metaphor to the was it the fish swim with the current or the kind of the jellyfish? Anyway, some kind of marine creature that just goes with the flow ultimately represents the skeptic ideal, as we're going to see through the chapter. So I thought that was a perfect metaphor. And it's also good because instinctively you think, oh, really? So it gets us to it actually challenges us right up there up front.
How much control do we actually have? The jellyfish doesn't have a lot of control. That's right.
It just flows with the current. It's in the moment.
Yes,
All right.
that's true.
So part one, I've just sort of got a few summary notes. Actually, I've got a few more pointed things I wanted to say about two. So who wants to handle one? Maybe someone else.
Well, I can do one, and you guys do the rest, if you like. Okay, I'll just run you through my summary. Well, just that first part, of course, you've already covered it. They both the both schools of Epicurus and Aristotle that human health requires belief, but the skeptics will move against that. So they it starts off on 281, but both are open to attack and vulnerable to nature. Both systems, the Epicureans and the Aristotelians, are both vulnerable to attack and open to attack and vulnerable to nature. So the successful creature is more flexible, using natural instinct with ambition or oppositional structure, like the fish swimming in the current, or like nomads was the other one that she used, wasn't it? So the successful creature would be the more flexible creature, a creature like that analogy to animal behavior again, the natural instinct. So both Epicurus and Aristotle encourage a life set against nature that challenges and opposes and wards off natural accidents, which is in opposition again to what the skeptics are trying to do. They're trying to set up more of a controlling aspect.
But interestingly, I know I'm sort of jumping ahead about 1,000 years, more 2,000 years. The nature really isn't as flexible as the skeptics sort of making out. Like natural
Yeah.
selection only benefits those mutations that just by pure chance, according to Darwin, turn out to be sort of adaptive. They fit the environment better, whatever those things are. So it's not that nature bends, and changes to adjust to something. It's just that given enough individuals in the species, some of them will survive and some won't, and the ones that survive just so happen to have variations that make them more adaptive. So I don't know, just offered that up.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah.
So, and just to add to that too, the metaphor, and this is, I think, perhaps where the metaphor reaches the end of its usefulness. You can think of the fish swimming, but a fish is not a creature without commitments. Basically, a fish is committed, as you've gestured to there, Courtney. A fish is committed to reproducing, and all the things that go along with that. First of all, surviving, and secondly, reproducing, and all the things that go along with that. And as we know, many fish undergo, they create the most amazing kind of displays or nests to attract the opposite sex, or in the case of salmon, the amazing journey they take up the river and so on. So, the metaphor of the fish, or the marine environment, insofar as it goes, ignores again those many commitments which actually do go along with life according to nature.
Yeah, that's a good point, Judy.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Courtney. Natural selection doesn't necessarily give us the best outcome. It's just the one that has the most power in the end. What will emanate and what evolves isn't necessarily the best version of anything.
Well, I mean, we're just not that flexible by nature. We might be lucky that we have a certain trait. That's all.
I'll just say one more thing, sorry, Jody, before you go on. I thought it was interesting too that Nussbaum has set it up here that Nikidian is already a committed Epicurean before she's exposed to the skeptic arguments. And I suppose that's been done deliberately, because if Nussbaum hadn't started with skepticism, we probably wouldn't have even got to the third chapter.
Right.
So we've already got we've got a setup here where Nikidian's been indoctrinated or enculturated into the Epicurean school, and now she's going to encounter the skeptic thing. So I thought that was an interesting way she set it up, and it probably is a way to showcase the skeptic position at its most effective with someone who's already enculturated into a different school.
Adversarial, yes.
Yes, yeah, it is exactly that, isn't it? She does compare it quite often through the chapter all the way. Okay, so we're still on 281. Nikidian is asked to make distinction or between right and wrong, or commitments to right and wrong, true and false, and that must also bring about vulnerability. When she was in the Epicurean school. But the skeptics claim Nikidian will be challenged by bodily pain, which is considered the evil in the Epicurean school, which adds to her anxiety and her suffering, according to Sextus. We're up onto 282 now, for herself and others. Also, she's challenged by arguments from other systems. So, for example, Stoic reminders from earlier life about selfless courage or stalwart endurance, or the value of virtue and reason. If someone was to bring those arguments up to her, would she be swayed or affected by that? So 283, Nikidian could be thrown into uncertainty at that point. But it's really perception versus reason. And this, it says, ends her happy life. So any challenge to parts of the system will bring disturbance in those other systems, the Epicurean system and the others. Any challenge to parts of the system will bring disturbance about the gods, the soul, or matter, or natural phenomena, parameters of life and death, continuity of bodies, structure of the universe. All those examples are given, those things that might bring trouble for her. On to 284. Many people hold fervent and dogmatic views without studying philosophy. And they're wanting to be right. Doesn't, you know, even if they're not into philosophy, there's just average people, they're still going to want to hold views and be right. And the skeptics say that the central human disease is indeed a disease of belief. So belief itself is the illness. And of course, why? Because it brings those factors of commitment and concern and care and vulnerability, all those things that will bring trouble in a way. So we move then on to 285.
That's a good point. I want to underline for me that point that it's not just philosophers who have problems because they have commitments to beliefs. It's also the ordinary people, and that they have beliefs about all sorts of different things. Which it makes this also a little bit confusing, because later on she'll talk about, if you can bracket out belief, there are still motivating forces, and some of them are like laws and customs, as if they just somehow blindly put pressures on us to act in a certain way. But I don't know, I don't buy it. Obviously there are beliefs there that how can you say that I've somehow bracketed out my beliefs about marriage, but on the other hand, I take marriage or social convention or the law as some sort of basic motivating force that works on the organism in a natural way, and therefore I obey it. Those parts of the system, I just think the skeptics don't deal with what belief actually is. They just move the goalposts. I think any Stoic would say, no, that's belief that you're talking about. And so would the Epicureans for sure, because they would say your belief extends into the unconscious. Whereas well, they wouldn't use that particular terminology, but that's what they would mean. And the skeptics wouldn't hold that, of course. They would say that, well, I don't know, they'd say something quite different.
Yeah, can I just clarify from that, Jody, that the skeptics are saying being vulnerable to challenges and uncertainty is the enemy. That's like that. They're saying that's a bad thing.
Well, in terms of not so much uncertainty, but the in making a commitment to a belief, or you know, it's going to bring up concern and care. It's going to bring up those human emotions of attachment. You know, you're going to be attached to the outcome, and therefore you'll be vulnerable. You'll be emotionally vulnerable. So
they're saying they're slanting that in a negative
that's negative for them. They see that as negative.
Which is a kind of commitment when you think about it, really. I mean, it's a belief. It's a prioritization, you know. It's buying the Epicurean ideal of ataraxia, but saying, oh well, but we're not going to approach it in that way. So yeah, I think they are vulnerable, particularly in comparison to the Epicureans there, because they've got exactly the same ideal. They just perhaps less, you know, maybe a little bit less honest about the commitments that are involved. But I'm happy to go on with section 2.
I'm just going to finish. I'll just finish 285. I've got just a couple of lines here. The radical cure is the purgation of all cognitive commitment from human life. So they want to purge all cognitive commitment. So to remove conceit and rashness, Nussbaum feels there is a quasi-dogmatic element despite Sextus's denials. And that's this ideal, this sort of idea of the paradox I keep seeing emerge all the way through this chapter. So how does this shape ethical belief, she asks? We will look at Nikidean's therapy, what feelings, desires, and attitudes she holds, and Sextus is an attempt to return to its purest origins, I've written. So there was a reference here to Arcesilaus and Carneades. I'm not sure why I wrote that down. Judith, what was that about?
Well, so that's right at the end of section 1. And she says she's going to leave it aside, what Arcesilaus and Carneades. Now, I'm pretty sure they were from the Platonic Academy in its skeptical phase. So sort of 2 generations after the death of Socrates, they kind of lent heavily into a skeptical mode. And certainly there are elements in Socrates's practice that could justify some of that. But she's leaving that aside now, the extent to which the Platonic Academy identified with skeptical ideals in that period.
Right.
Did you say humanist origins then, Jody? Was that what that quote was? Humanist origins?
A Pyrrhonist. The Pyrrhonists, there was the academic school of skepticism and the Pyrrhonist school of skepticism. And personally, I don't know what the difference is.
Well, so Pyrrho, very interesting character, and we see a bit about that in the chapter. I'm pretty sure, I'll just double check this, but I'm pretty sure he was taken along with Alexander to the east. And so, because Alexander took a posse of philosophers with him, and she does cover that in the chapter as to whether he was exposed to, some of the Indian wise men. Let me just double check this, that he actually went along. Yeah, he went with Anaxarchus along with Alexander on his Indian expedition. That suggests that he was very well thought of and influential at the time.
What was it? Pyrrhonus.
Yeah, so named after Pyrrho, who was this first very influential skeptic. Not the very first of them, but kind of the most, I suppose, most clearly identified with the school going forward.
Nothing to do with pirate victory from that.
Well, but the names are related. That was to do with Pyrrhus, who was a general who fought against Rome. So they're Greek names that are related to each other, but this was Pyrrho, the philosopher.
Yep.
On a related thing before you tear ahead, because I know you're about to launch into the next bit, but
you are Courtney, you're doing it.
Oh no, I think Judas was cool to do it. That's cool. But no, I just wanted to make a point before I forget, because I think it's an interesting talking point that because we're talking about sages and whether they met the Indians and how much Indian philosophy came across and may or may not have kind of got mixed up with skepticism. I was curious that this connection that was set up in the first part that you just read, there's a bit in there where she says, for example, that in Epicurus's case, taking pain as evil potentially worsens our situation, because when you experience the pain, you have the belief that the bad is now with me. The skeptic says that the pain cannot be avoided. It's just a natural part of life. But if you take away the belief, she will remain unaffected in matters of belief and will endure only moderate suffering in respect of what she can't avoid. And so thinking about that in terms of modern mindfulness, for example, and trying to think through that, basically that gives you the idea that instead of, say, you meet some people who talk about Eastern spirituality and they say something like they have to remove the ego or have a state of no mind where there's no thoughts. Somehow they feel bad if they're having thoughts. They've got to transcend this thought experience. But following it from a more, at least this particular form of skepticism, it would take, just like pain is a part of the world, a part of natural experience, so would thoughts be part of the natural experience of being a person. So rather than having committed beliefs about the thought content, one could happily just have thoughts, just as one can happily, or only to a moderate form of negative affect, experience pain, and likewise thoughts without having committed beliefs towards them, so that a person can live happily with whatever thoughts pop up. So if I'm reading that correctly, that would be a more skeptical approach to interpreting like the more modern Buddhist kind of thinking, without having to go to the extreme of saying I'm using meditation to erase my mind of all content, for example.
Yeah, that I mean, that could be right. And she does draw, I mean, she does gesture later in the chapter to, you know, the developments in the 60s and 70s in the West, which explicitly borrowed, at least superficially, from Eastern traditions about you know, non-commitment and so on. So yeah, I think there is some deep link
may
there.
I say though that in my limited knowledge, I know that they don't try to eradicate thought. They let thought come. It isn't. They don't try to negate it or stop it. Or they know that they can't. It's just the Buddhists.
No, but I've met plenty of practitioners who tell me they're trying to get rid of their thought.
Well, if they were really going to try to be, you know, following their own tradition properly, no, they wouldn't be trying to do that. But anyway.
I've got some experience. I've done a few of those. I've done a bit of Goenka, you know, silent retreats, and the Mahasi Noting, the other Burmese guy. So it is all transitional. So it's exposure therapy at the beginning, you know, getting used to them and really downplaying the value of all these sensations, including pain, you know, including a monkey brain. And they do have as their ideal jhanic states, you know, jhana 1, jhana 2, jhana 3, stream entry, they call it. They've got different names, but they are all states of immersion where the thinking does disappear and they're simply present. So, you know, they're tolerant of thoughts as a triage state, but their stated goal pretty well is no thinking going on, just being.
And I only bring it up to say, so I don't think the skeptical tradition as we see it here is the same thing as that tradition. That's my point by making that point.
Yes, it's a very Eastern thing. Yes. Yeah, the West doesn't want to give away thinking.
Yeah, well, again, and I think this is a good point, right? Like, we're still in the Western rational tradition, like, I think. Is that right, Judith?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think so. Yeah. Although there are sort of suggestions of something slightly different, and that's what she actually opens with in the very first line of section 2 here. So I'll just keep going with that. Skepticism as sextus empiricus. Now, he's a relatively late source, that's important to remember, but he is our most complete source on ancient skepticism. As sextus reports, is an ability, dunamis. Now, that's really interesting. It's not anything other than that. It's a power, it's a faculty, a dunamis, to set up an opposition of appearances and thoughts in any way at all. An ability, that's another way of expressing it, from which we come through the equal force, isostrenea, of the opposing statements and states of affairs, first into suspension, epoche, and after that into freedom from disturbance, ataraxia. And as she says correctly, this account is revealing each of its terms that needs to be scrutinized. So yes, she draws attention to the fact that skeptical, she terms it therapy, we could just say the approach, is an ability or capability, a dunamis. And that is in opposition to the idea that skepticism is a techne, or an art or a science, an organized body of knowledge. So obviously in the Platonic tradition, a techne could be something like carpentry or cookery or dressmaking or being a general or whatever. It's an organized body of knowledge, but that's exactly not what the skeptical approach represents.
Yeah, and I wondered about this because she even uses the word knack a few times. So I wondered if this is kind of a bit of an anti-Socratic kind of style, because Socrates is talking about a form of knowledge, what virtue would be, and this is rejection. In a sense, it's like, now we've just got this knack. You'll just work it out. If you listen to yourself, you'll just figure out that you've got this knack for dealing with things.
So it's a personal power rather than a structured power built on an infrastructure of knowledge or like a scientific.
Yeah, exactly. That's
existential power.
Yeah, and also something almost mysterious. You know, dunamis has got this mystique around it. I mean, the gods have dunamis. So yeah, it's a very interesting choice of terms. So, well, as she then asks, well, what is one learning when one learns to be a skeptic? It's not a techne, it's what is it? And this is where it kind of sounds a bit like special pleading. In any way at all, can, Sextus says, be taken in several ways. It tells us the ability is not a special recondite faculty, but just an ordinary or natural capability. So I guess that means anyone can do it. Anyone can cultivate it, if we like. And so then there's this term isostheneia, the equal force of the equal persuasiveness of two opposing claims. And then there's the suspension of commitment, the epoche. It's where one hesitates, one refrains from committing to one view or another. And finally is the end point, is the ataraxia, the unburdened and tranquil condition of the soul.
Can I say something about the opposing force? Because this really ties in with our Cartesian meditations. So she says the turn towards skepticism begins when whoever discover, as they inquire, that to every argument, another argument of equal strength is opposed to it. Look, this is the whole kind of thing for the skeptics, is that everything you believe, every belief you have, you can find another belief that stands in complete opposition to it. But that's exactly what Descartes does, right? He goes, no, there isn't. There's no opposite belief to the belief that I'm thinking right now, that I'm doubting this experience. So he's found something which you can't pose an opposing view to. You can't make yourself disappear, you know, as the experiencing thing. So that's why he then says, well, so we can have certain ideas which are clear and distinct, and i.e. that they can't be opposed. And again, that fits with the whole Stoic thing. I just think it's genius thinking about how it's like his noticing that just that one thing is a really powerful challenge to the whole therapy of skepticism, because the therapeutic technique of the skeptic, the knack, is to apply to every belief an opposing belief. And I was just thinking, even the Stoics tried they weren't able to formulate as clear an impression of a indubitable belief that Descartes was able to do. But in Epictetus, you see such things, for example, as the sun is in the center of the sky, so therefore it must be daytime. Obviously, Descartes says, well, of course we could be dreaming, or an evil demon could be fooling us. But even under those conditions, no, we can't doubt that I'm doubting, that I'm thinking. So I just wanted to bring back to the Cartesian idea, because it's so simple and so genius. And if you think about what the skeptics are doing here, Descartes, with that one move, makes skepticism really problematic.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's his next move to to establish the existence of God that's probably more controversial, I would say. But you're right. I mean, that is where his genius lay. Whether he was explicitly responding to ancient skepticism or not, maybe, I don't know. But yeah, I think it's but also that, and this is the other point I made, I think, when you raised this on Facebook, Courtney, it's the ancient skeptics were, in a sense, not as thoroughgoing skeptics as Descartes' thought experiment. So in a sense, they didn't need to disregard the body. You know, did we really need to go down the disregarding the body and rejecting everything path in order to establish the existence of the I? That's kind of the question, I guess, that remains.
Yeah, but in his doing so, I think he goes so far over the line that he actually makes an even stronger case for it. Like I was thinking about it, I was thinking, if he can absolutely do something ridiculous, like cause us to not even believe in God or the world or the body, it's like Mr. Hardcore 100%. And he's ended up by showing that we can't have this counter belief against the doubting self. He ends up proving undeniably that, you know, it's the use of reason that's important in the way things turn out, because we know that we can't doubt this thinking self. So, you know, therefore it can be adduced, it can be deducted by reason, it can be experienced by reason, but whether we reason correctly about things or incorrectly kind of decides where we end up. And that goes perfectly in the rationalist direction and the Stoic direction. And again, totally undoes the skeptical position. I just don't know. I just think it's awesome.
I think like even I think you're overstating what Descartes, the quality of Descartes' arguments. But even in the weaker version that I think is what he's actually done, which is just proved the small I, not the big I. But that was the point I was trying to make last time, that he gets to the thinking thing, but the I is like, there's more to the I, and he's sort of playing on that and sort of switching it up when he gets to the conclusion. But even then, I think in that weaker form, I would agree. Like it still does have something to the skeptical. It puts in a shoe in the boot of the thoroughgoing skeptic. But yeah, I'm not sure of how far the ancients were on that. I'll take Judas well on that. Yeah, they were doubting the self. But I've been thinking more about the Descartes thing. It's just such a weird, like, it's kind of, because the way that he presents it frustrates me more, because it's like, why are we even doubting the self? Like that's we don't need to argue about things or give reasons for things that we sort of all accept. Like we can skip that and then get to the more interesting things. And he sort of uses the argument for the self and then goes, oh yeah, so there's bodies and souls and all these other things that he's sort of going to drag along with it. And it's like, wait, that's the stuff you've actually got to argue for. I'm sort of willing to, be a radical realist and just accept that other people exist, and not have a argument for that.
But again, and tying it back to this, like he gets us beyond the skeptical argument. And I think like this whole, like you mentioned before, Jody, ataraxia, that is taken as a kind of non-dogmatic thing. It's a psychological state that human beings are directed towards for some reason. So somehow he's sort of treating it not as like a dogmatic thing. It's not an item of belief. It's just a psychological function that we move toward. And so what he's really interested in is a practical medical how-to therapy for achieving ataraxia at the expense of some sort of epistemic knowledge to understand what the world is, and then maybe think about establishing a medicine on the basis of a scientific notion of, obviously we can't talk about scientific notions, but you know what I mean, like that there's a true kind of knowledge that we can progress towards. And I think that's exactly, Descartes picks on the same argument, and he's moving towards that progressive knowledge of what would a real medicine look like, what would a real science of mechanics look like, for example. So I don't know, I just see it as all really interconnected. I think Descartes really is responding directly to the skeptics. But anyway.
Is it the same as eudaimonia? Is ataraxia the same as eudaimonia?
No. So eudaimonia is the Platonic, Aristotelian, and Stoic ideal or ultimate function of life, and it's the translation of it is well-being, a good spirit. Whereas ataraxia just means absence of disturbance. It's a very neutral term. There's no good. There's no you aspect, where you being the prefix that means good. Ataraxia is literally not being disturbed. That's the skeptical and Epicurean ideal.
Oh, so it is a bit like the Buddhist Vipassana jhana state things, where you're just present without any disturbance or awareness of self, apparently. Oh, good. I've learned something.
Before you leave page 286, can I just quickly draw attention to how Nussbaum is pointing out here that Sextus is aiming his know-how at results. So she's using the word know-how, which of course implies knowledge. So his know-how at the results, or practicing his know-how in a particular way to produce those results. You know, so anyway, it's just that it keeps coming up all the time.
But I think that's
of the knowledge that we're using to counteract knowledge.
But I think that's ambiguity.
Belief, you know.
I think that's the ambiguity, because rather than say that using his knowledge, she's talking in that language of knack, you know, the know-how, the dynamis or whatever. It's not clear, is it, whether it's a knowledge or whether it's something else.
Okay, so just at the end of page 286, we have to investigate, well, what is this process? How do these oppositional procedures produce their results? Now, very interestingly, in this following passage, Sextus identifies the starting point, that's arche in Greek, of skeptical inquiry and its end goal, telos. The starting point is arche aitiodes. And he used the example, and this is very curious in the circumstances, great-natured people. Well, who are they? You know, as skeptics, surely we're refraining from judging people as great-natured. But anyway, as she says, presumably people of energy and ability, being disturbed by the discrepancies and contradictions they encounter and being at a loss, embark upon inquiry into the truth about things. So this is where skepticism makes an appeal to rational inquiry, curiously enough. And so, as she says at the end of the paragraph, so skepticism has the same original motives as the dogmatic search for truth. And then we have another lengthy quote from Sextus. So there's a project to achieve ataraxia and moderate affect, metriopatheia, in things necessary. So philosophizing involves sorting out the impressions, which are true, which are false. But then there's a disagreement. There seems to be equal weight on both sides. And so the person in this position, suspending judgment, just happens to have, and this is this very apparently critical idea, toukikos, which means by fortune, by chance, just happen to encounter freedom from disturbance. It just happens to go along with this epoche. And there's a very famous anecdote about the great painter Apelles, who was getting frustrated about trying the way to represent a horse that was so fatigued and so worked up it had foam on its flanks, as we sometimes see in racehorses. And then he just, in his frustration, flung the sponge at the canvas, and it just happened to get the exact effect he wanted. So this sort of peculiar anecdote is kind of the archetype of skeptical, of arriving at a skeptical result.
And this story is extremely reminiscent of a Zen story, by the way, that Alan Watts tells. But quickly, you know, the great-natured people. I thought when I was reading that it was very reminiscent of Aristotle's megalosukos, you know, which is a virtue for him, the crown of the virtues, I think.
Yeah, but hang on, the skeptics shouldn't be talking about that. They make there's nothing about virtue in their worldview, right? Well, where does a great soul person occur in the skeptic worldview? They don't.
Yeah, it's weird. But in the Zen story, by the way, it's so similar. There's this story about a guy who's trying to chop wood or something, and there's a strange creature appears in the clearing, and he tries to kill it with his axe. And every time he swings his axe, the creature disappears. I guess it's a weird, creepy bunny rabbit, but it just vanishes. And so he turns around, he swings at it, and again and again and again, every time he swings at it, it disappears. And he gets more and more frustrated, and eventually he gives up in frustration and flings his axe behind him, and the axe kills the creature. And it's an idea about how they tell these stories about how enlightenment happens, for example. Very similar to this way that ataraxia just creeps up on you and happens accidentally when you're not trying to do it. And that seems to be part of the method, because I guess giving up on the belief that you should get somewhere is the opposition to the belief that you should move towards ataraxia, right?
Yeah, but it's kind of a it's not exactly a program, is it? I mean, you can't just go around flinging axes and sponges everywhere, right? You can't just manifest your frustration in the hope that it will have a good outcome, right? So in that sense, this is yet another way in which the skeptical program lacks practical application.
That's right.
But she does bring back that story again, doesn't she, at the end of it, because she's saying, well, isn't that what he wanted anyway? He actually got the outcome he wanted anyway, was her point.
Well, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
finally.
exactly.
Yeah.
So the nihilist in a way, they're saying give up on love and you'll find love.
Yep, yeah, that's right.
That was that old chestnut. I don't know about that one.
So at the end of page 287, we're returning back to Nikidian's experience and how she's going to receive this new doctrine. So as he's going to reinforce the skeptical tutor is going to reinforce the ideal of ataraxia, and Nikidian's going to be told that she will fail to get what she wants from philosophy. But Sextus claims in this very failure, this the foam and the axe thing, in the paralysis of reason by its own oppositional activity, she gets what she wanted all along. In short, the skeptical suspension is a more efficacious route to the very same end the dogmatist goes for. The skeptical ability, this dunamis, seems to be the ability to go about deliberately setting up these oppositions in such a way that the happy chance, tunkanos, happens regularly with respect to every subject, ethical and non-ethical, ordinary and philosophical, on which Nikidian thinks it's important to get to the truth. Skeptical ability, this dunamis, releases reason from the burdens and the vulnerabilities. So, since, however, the disease is not so much of reason and belief as is reason and belief themselves, the cure, being itself an operation of reason involving at least temporarily belief, will be likely to have a peculiar relation to itself. It will wish to take itself out of the pupil's life along with the commitments it purges. So, So just to recur to the Epicurean belief system for a moment, and this leads us into page 289, and this appeal to nature. What is it that is natural? What does the non-human animal pursue? Now, the Epicurean view takes an uncorrupted creature from the condition of nature to its own proper end. But of course, the skeptic's going to take a somewhat different tack. The Epicurean rejects bodily pain as the worst thing that can occur, but the skeptic, conversely, does not express objections to natural and necessary bodily pain. This was what you brought up earlier on, Courtney. What, after all, is the point of having objections to something that we cannot help? Pain is a part of nature. And so instead of complete painlessness, which is the Epicurean ideal, the skeptic adopts as his end a target that is readily available in nature without the agency of dogma. Complete freedom from disturbance in matters of belief and moderate affect, metriopatheia, in necessary physical sufferings. For inasmuch as he is a human being, he will suffer through his senses, aestheticos. But if he does not in addition have the opinion that what he suffers is bad by nature, he will suffer moderately. So that's an interesting difference from the Epicurean position.
Mm. Didn't we already establish that belief was the foundational element? Was that the Epicureans, was it? Not the...
Well, the
Somebody's...
Epicurean would say that a lot of our beliefs are mistaken, but he would not reject belief per se, which is it. But that's what the skeptic is doing, rejecting belief as part of the problem.
Right, yes.
And so at the top of page 290, rather, Nussbaum says, nor is it merely a verbal difference between the Epicureans and the skeptics. It's a substantial difference about a definite view about things, how ought to go on. The skeptic gives up all commitments that take him beyond the way life actually goes. Now, that's actually, interestingly, a little bit reminiscent of Stoicism, right? You know, the Stoic ideal is to accept nature, accept life as it actually occurs, and reduce our negative responses in that way. Interestingly, parallel with the skeptic position here. He can relax and let life happen to him. It's an important part of Sextus's distinction between the skeptical way of life and its rivals to insist that he alone does not teach a techne, a systematic art of life.
May I just...
sure, go. Yeah,
sorry,
go
Judy,
ahead.
just before we get off, just at the end of 289, I think, it says, just bringing it back to that idea of he does not believe it's bad by nature and thus will only suffer moderately, that idea of suffering moderately. But he does bring up the idea of the person who is in hunger or thirst cannot believe otherwise, right? So that's that idea of, yes, Courtney was saying the other day, like, you know, with that idea of denial of the body. Well, they're not denying the body. The body does exist, yeah? Because they're saying, you know, hunger and thirst is happening. You can't deny it. It, you know, it is they can't believe otherwise. So that is one belief. You know, they do take on physical existence in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jodie. Yeah, thanks for that. I hadn't really clocked that. You're absolutely right. Towards the end of page 290, I thought it was very interesting, this position about syntonos. So this is a interesting word. Syntonos means, well, it's to do with a word about tension. And in the Stoic worldview, everything is in tension. You know, everything is pneuma in different degrees and forms of tension. Here, the skeptics are rejecting this intensity that is implied in the word syntonos. They're rejecting any kind of form of intensity. This intensity of pursuit and avoidance, the skeptic claims, is at the root of all disturbance. To have a telos or goal in the usual way to strain the bow of one's life towards it as a target is a recipe for disturbance. What the skeptic has done is not so much to introduce a rival account of the telos as to undermine the whole notion of reaching for a telos, except ataraxia. What is the end of human life? Oh, just life, just the way it actually goes on if you don't mess up its flow by introducing beliefs. So that's a very interesting approach. But as Nussbaum then points out, well, Nikidian is not going to be altogether inactive. So how can she approach life on this basis? Now, as she sketches this background, from Aristotle on, it has been agreed that living creatures can in fact be motivated to move and act without belief by merely a combination of impressions, that's sense impressions, phantasiae, as to how things are, and desires. Phantasiae or phenomena are the ways the world looks to us, what we see it as the ways that it strikes us. And they are different from belief because they involve no commitment as to the way things really are. Well, I think the Stoics would contest that, but anyway, So fantasia involve operations of the cognitive faculties, but she goes on, they involve no attempt to sort out and coordinate the impressions, arriving at a general view. Even with respect to a single occasion, the person who reports a fantasia can perfectly consistently go on to say, but of course, I have no idea how the matter really stands, and I don't care. Thus, animals who have fantasia, but neither memory nor belief, will just move as things strike them in the moment. They can have no general views of any sort, including ethical views.
Yeah, see, this is where I get really, I think the whole thing starts to fall apart at this point. Because
why are they comparing animal consciousness with human consciousness? They're completely different things.
Well, I think so. I think it makes sense to say that the human being is doing something much more than that, because deeply our cognitions are based around goods. Is this thing good or is this thing not good? And that good is the kind of thing that constitutes belief and commitment. And therefore the Stoics would have us to understand what is actually good rather than what is just the appearance of the good. So not doing that leads people into behaving like animals, which is what the skeptics are saying is a good thing, which is really problematic if you find out that your habitual practices are actually not good for you. But it's too late then, because you've just blindly followed along this trail that's got you addicted to heroin all of a sudden.
I don't know why they've even gone. Why have they gone there? Why have they gone there to this animal analogy and promoting? I guess they're trying to get away from the whole the constructs thing, are they? They're trying to get away.
They're trying to get away from that.
Yeah.
Can I just read the sentence here? Or I think I wrote down a sentence here that, like, if we add, I think you just said this one, Judy, if we add memory to fantasia, we will get richer temporal connections and the possibility of being moved by habits, traditions, know-how, even principles acting as causes for action, but stop short of assenting to the view that something is actually the case. How ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely, Jodie. That's right. And so on the Stoic view, humans are the only animals who have a sense of time, have a sense of, well, they can remember the past, they can plan for the future. Now, I think even the higher animals to a certain extent do have a sense of time as well. But that again goes to undermine this idea that they're literally living in the moment. I mean, if you have a dog, you know that they build up habits. They have expectations, obviously. Even if it's just as simple an expectation as getting their dinner at the appropriate time, they do have a limited view of the future. And humans have got an incredibly sophisticated structure around conception of identity through time, relationships through time, practice through time. So this is kind of very artificial, I would say, this notion that we can attain some kind of quasi jellyfish existence in the moment, if that is really what's being proposed here.
If that is what's being
Even if we think, I 100% agree. I think this is really, really crazy way of thinking, because it's saying something like, even if you take the idea that the dog isn't having beliefs when it does those habitual things, it just has the habit of knowing through some sort of psychological impulse built up over time that the food will be there at this when the owner walks in the door, whatever. So in such a case, that's placed as a kind of like natural psychological kind of thing related to the creature. Then why then isn't belief the same sort of thing in the higher animals, if that's what we are? Like in that case, it would be appropriate that human beings have belief, and beliefs are useful and they help us conduct our lives and things like that. I don't get it. Like, at which point does belief become evil? I don't know. It's strange.
Yeah. Well, let's move on, because we're we've got a fair bit to get through still. So just to go to page 292. If we I think that's what you were just mentioning, Jodie. If we add memory to fantasia but stop short of belief, we will get richer temporal connections. Well, what animals do not have is reasons for action, that is, views they are committed to as correct. Well, again, that's probably even a stretch as regards to the higher animals, because they have very pressing reasons to to do what they do. And again, the Stoic account accounts for this. It says every animal has the overriding impulse to preserve its life, and that accounts for so much of animal behavior. So it's a huge commitment, and it's very hard to see how the skeptics could convincingly argue this. But anyway, they go on to say that humans can move and act without belief. They go on using their faculties. Faculties? Okay. The world strikes them now this way, now that. They're influenced by their desires, their cognitive activities, even their memories. And so there's a long quote here again from Sextus. Clinging to appearances, fantasiae, then, we live without belief, according to the practices of life, ten biodicen teresin. Since we cannot be altogether inactive. Well, that's true. And then it seems to concede everything around normal life. Just where it's sketched a sort of a radically non-normal way of proceeding, then it adds back all the things that are normal, like the guidance of nature, the necessity of the feelings, transmission of laws and customs, instruction of the arts. Okay.
Yeah, things that we would normally associate with belief.
Yeah, exactly. And so even so far as to say that it is good to perform conventional religious observances and bad to disregard them. Well, if we're going to allow conventional religion in our skeptical worldview, then I don't know quite why we're pretending that we're so radical. But anyway,
are they allowing religion because it's the law and they have to do it by law? Is that the only reason?
Well, pretty much, but it's a nomos. If they're going to allow all the nomoi, then yeah. So anyway, but as she summarizes, we have 4 motivating forces, 4 ways life can strike or impress us to engender movement. So these are all the ways that while suspending actual belief, we can still function in the world. We use the senses and the reasoning powers, and we go by our natural bodily feelings and desires, listening to hunger, not as a signal of the bad, but as a push from our instinctual nature. And as she says, perhaps the most interesting part of Sextus's claim, we are guided by the habits we have formed and the skills we have acquired. Nikidian will acquire no new ethical beliefs, but she will also not struggle against the one she has. She will simply stop caring about whether they are true. Treat them as impressions whose truth value is indeterminate, and viewed in this way, they cease to be beliefs. And this, we now discover, applies to her verbal behavior. So this, and again, it probably comes down a lot to this whole thing around how these are expressed. Many of her utterances will have the grammatical form of assertions, but whenever she says something, then Sextus tells us in bringing these utterances forward, she is telling us what strikes her, tohiautoi phenomenon, what appears to her, and reporting her experience without belief, not making any firm claim about anything outside of this. Diogenes says that skeptical utterances are confessions or avowals, exomologesis, says. And this sort of remark is repeated over and over again by Sextus, on his guard lest he seem to dogmatize and aware that ordinary language is, as ordinarily used, a committed and dogmatic instrument. It shows us what Nikidian might expect to say as she is being cured, and also what she can expect to hear from her doctor. So I think, yeah, here we conclude with some of the difficulties with the skeptic position. First of all, that in the end, we've added back all the things that seem to constitute normal life. But finally, is it all to do with how we express our experiences?
Yeah, it's very problematic. I just can't get my head around why. I mean, skepticism might work if you just go, well, all of that's rubbish. Forget about laws and customs. Forget about religion. Forget about everything. It's all just bunkum. But he doesn't do that. It gets yeah.
Well, how can you use the word confession or avowal if you look at the root or the, you know, where it comes from, the basis of the word confession, surely that is a verbalizing of belief, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%, Jody.
Yeah.
We're just not feeling it.
All right, number 3.
Yep.
So basically, I've got some short notes, so this will be pretty quick. Except it goes on about those 10 points, doesn't it? Okay, so basically, anyone can come along and become a skeptic, which was always Nikidian's problem with some of the other schools. And you didn't even necessarily have to have the Paideia. Everyone's welcome, pretty much. What else? The teachings, the skeptical teachings were prominent in 2 of the 3 major schools of medicine of the day. And we get told here, well, she compares the empirical and methodical school. The
Methodical.
methodical. So the Methodist is skeptical according to Sextus, and the empirical isn't, because it makes these positive assertions. It positively asserts that we cannot know what is not evident to the senses, and thus, because it's making a dogmatic position about a theory of knowledge, it needs to be rejected. So the methodical, or the Methodist version, is following the common practice of life, simply allow themselves to be guided by what they experience, without any commitment to any particular method of procedure or view of knowledge. They're naturally moved in a way that is motivated by their professional training, but does not involve any thick commitment to or belief in its rightness. To counter an observed alien symptom with a remedy. And this is where we get this quote that comes up a few times. It is evident that conditions that are naturally alien to us compel us to move toward their dissolution, or even a dog, when it is pricked by a thorn, proceeds to remove it. This is how the Methodist doctor practices bodily medicine, using the techniques he has learned because they come naturally to him, not because he thinks they are right. This is pretty interesting from a psychological perspective, in my opinion, because the empirical version that's getting critiqued here would look a lot like the biomedical sort of psychiatric version, where you have a very strong truth statements about what mental illness is or looks like and how to classify it, for example. And the methodical version, the Methodist version, would look like something, in what I think anyway, would look like something you'd find in the phenomenological tradition, where they talk instead about just looking at the experience of the patient's life and not making any truth statements about, you know, whether they have a mental illness or a schizophrenia or anything like that, but rather just trying to view the client's situation through the lens of their own experience, through their life world, through their life, all that sort of stuff. And that somehow they will, a bit like the Rogerian thing, they will be able to find their own way out of their difficulties just through this kind of existential exploration. I think that's a really interesting kind of comparison. Anyway, did you guys have any views on that or not really? I thought it was kind of cool.
No, I think that's yeah. I mean, and that's the whole psychiatric treatment model. You know, I've worked in for a long time with the DSM-5, and it traps people. Unfortunately, it does trap people in belief systems that they take on board. They're imposed externally by medical, you know, professionals, and yeah, it is a trap. you know, really. And I know it's all coming from a good place of trying to deal with emergency situations. It's just it's overly intrusive, I think, in people's actual experience. And it doesn't need to go as far as it has. It's all this saving everyone, you know, without any risk. And, you know, institutionalized medicine has become caught up in the whole thing of their risk factor rather than the you know, the patient's risk factor. And I guess that's what I thought when you're saying that. You know, it's like, what are we actually trying to do here? And it's it's
So
very
in
saving people or saving fucking the institutions providing the help.
yeah, so in the modern context, it's very political. Obviously, there's not a political dimension that we can see here, but it's interesting that that it tends to go in that direction when you bracket out truth or belief.
Fixed beliefs around causes and conditions. That's right.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, what would life be like if we did treat people with more flexibility and tolerance rather than having, say, experts who can make prescriptions about what reality says about their situation, for example.
Absolutely.
But, so going to point one, the skeptic's arguments, like the arguments. So these are the 10-point guide that she's used throughout the text. She wants to look at the similarities between Epicurean practice, for example, and how it sits within the medical analogy. So she says,
may I just say before you jump there, can any of us here, can you explain to me that the idea of these modes and tropes? Obviously, I haven't read the skeptic literature, but these modes and tropes must be lists or some way of is that some sort of
look,
summary of how to deal with the arguments?
I think it must be, Jodie, but unfortunately she just gives a footnote to Annas and Barnes. And so that was a bit unsatisfactory. I'm assuming it's set piece kind of, you know, case studies or whatever that came up in the medical literature. But in a sense, well, that's kind of important to actually understand her point. So yeah, I think it's possible that she's, you know, got a bridge too far here in the bringing in this opposition between the empiricists and the Methodists, but without making it clear what how the different approaches worked. And I'd say that would be in these modes and tropes, which she doesn't really have space to explore, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, we get a feeling, don't we, that the empirical tradition is going to be a sort of system of knowledge, and obviously this other one, which looks at the experience of belief, has in this dogmatic position always has a counter argument that matches it. So yeah, without even listing them out, I feel like we can kind of get a feeling for what they're talking about, what the therapy would look like. For example, it would look like, you know, I come to see the therapist because I have the belief that you know, death is a bad thing for me. So depending on how strong that belief is in me, the skeptical doctor, using this Methodist approach, will match it with a belief of relatively similar strength. She makes a point of saying, doesn't want to be too powerful. And in fact, she's saying that the weaker beliefs can be targeted with weaker medicines, counter arguments. And that means, at least I picked up from reading this, that the weaker beliefs will be the ones that are kind of not necessarily logical, you know, they could be rhetorical, and she can use evidence and truth kind of willy-nilly a little bit. They're the weaker forms. I mean, that's how I construct it.
Sorry, it could just be simply that, because this is something that comes up in Seneca a little bit. A weaker belief might be one that's of shorter standing. You know, there's a temporal element to it. So Seneca sometimes says, oh, well, this particular erroneous belief is of such long standing that I can't apply my milder drugs. I have to go, you know, really go hard with my more violent violent approaches. So yeah, I think you're right, Courtney, that there is a gradation around the strength of the beliefs which are to be tackled here.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm.
So point one, the skeptics' arguments, like the arguments used by Epicurus, are good therapeutic arguments only if they are well directed towards their practical goal. We have already seen the skeptic claim that by opposing an equal argument to every argument, he can bring either himself or another into equipoise, and thence to suspension, and that ataraxia follows upon suspension. So we've seen that he claims to have discovered more effective means than the dogmatist to attain the dogmatist's own ends, which namely freedom from disturbance. Okay. So there's a lot said here about what suspension does. Towards the bottom of the page there, it says suspension frees her, first of all, from the burden of worrying about what is true and right. It frees her, second, from belief in a view of what is good, a belief that adds to her torment. When the thing deemed bad is present, it will release her as well from all the evils that come from the intense pursuit of any practical goal with eager conviction. These evils, and I thought this was pretty interesting, these evils prominently include emotion, arrogant confidence, and a restless excessive joy when the good is present, a gnawing fearfulness and watchfulness lest it vanish, a distressingly intense desire for the good before it is present. It is, if it should be absent, a grief intense because based on an evaluative belief and even a fantasized sense of guilt, the feeling that she is in a bad way because the Furies are punishing her for something she must have done. So the skeptic shares with other schools of the day, at least for the purposes of argument, the view that all these emotional states, including the uncertain kind of joy that is based upon the presence of unstable externals, are bad things to have in one's life because of their disturbing character. So it's not that different from Stoicism in a lot of ways. It's the assessment, right, that false goods, or false bads in that case, present with these emotional reactions. And the Stoic would say, so get rid of all your false beliefs. Whereas the skeptic is just saying, sorry, did I say skeptic twice? The Stoic would say that. The skeptic would say, get rid of all your beliefs. Throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. So the next one, too. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Anyone?
I was just looking at a little thing here where I looked up the 10 modes. It does say right at the end, it highlighted a sentence. Hang on, let me get it. The aim is to demonstrate the absence of constancy and, if successful in that endeavor, to conclude that no certainty can be predicated on such dubious foundations. So I guess they're just wanting us to see through them. Maybe they don't want us to actually delete them altogether, but these fixed positions, but just to see through them for their lack of inherent, truth or whatever. And maybe that's not a bad working position. It's not to delete them so much as, I don't know, is that what the skeptics are up to? They're trying to get us to pierce the veil of their inherent validity, maybe. I don't know that.
And do away with, and to do away with them altogether. Once you pierce them, they're gone. They're gone.
Right.
Really.
So they do want to exterminate them, do they?
Yeah, she says these emotions are based upon ethical beliefs, and Sextus suggests that only the complete extirpation of beliefs gets rid of them. Extirpation means to rip them out by the roots.
Yes.
The dogmatists all have one thing in common. All urge the intense, committed pursuit of some end. and of course the end is really the curing the disease of belief and ataraxia finally, I guess.
It's interesting at the very end before she goes, she actually goes and talks about 3 before she talks about 2. She comes back to 2 because it's more important. But just before she attacks 3, she says that she's bringing up that so they must claim that in inverted commas, this is what my experience causes me naturally to do. This is the teacher talking to Nikidian, you know. So this is what my experience causes me naturally to do. This is what I have observed so far to result from this. See what happens in your own case. So giving her, like, just stepping back and going, oh, well, you work it out, sort of thing, you know, which is what she'll be asked. She's asked to do that, to work it out herself, really, you know, ultimately. But
It's
anyway.
it's a bit of a fudge, though, isn't it? Just saying, "Oh, this is what's going to come." Like we're trying to understand what where it's coming from. In a sense, we're trying to get a bit below that, aren't we? Rather than just throw the towel in and go with what comes up naturally without having any insight into where that's coming from.
I guess it's just an act that we're all capable of. So number 3, the arguments addressed to Nikidian will be responsive to the particular case. That's the principle that we've been using all throughout. Chosen on account of her particular situation then. So again, as with our other 2 schools, this point is stressed through use of the medical analogy, is made in the Epicurean rather than the Aristotelian way. That is, the emphasis on attention to particularity comes in the context of attention to the pupil's particular pathology, not in the context of elaborating a norm of practice, wisdom, or health. The skeptic claims Sextus will argue in exactly the way suited to the nature of the pupil's disease. And that's where this idea of that the argument has to be matched exactly to the belief that the client has, and also to the degree, like the strength of the belief, and so on. And so it also implies, I think she says here, that the cure is for that person alone. They're not really concerned about curing other people, it seems like, right?
It's not a universal truth they're trying to apply. It's specific.
Yeah, and that idea of balance and degree. Remember, I was talking about the if it was a weak belief, you use a weak argument. So she says here, in short, the arguments must balance the degree and location of Nikidian's commitment, so as to bring her into equipoise in each case. So if she's vulnerable to persuasion and commitment, a good strong argument might sway her too much, convincing her that its conclusions were true, causing her, say, to overbalance from Epicureanism into Stoicism. The object is to get her to stop right in the middle. We may add that as Nikidian becomes more and more used to skeptic ways, she will quite possibly come to hold all of her convictions more and more lightly. So she will need progressively weaker and weaker arguments. Argument gradually affects its own removal from her life. At the end, I imagine that the bare posing of a question will already induce a shrug of indifference, and further argument will prove necessary. And what that says to me is that you might have quite strong arguments at the beginning, but they get weaker and weaker and weaker as you go along, until reason eventually purges itself along with the disease, which means to me, and I think she says it here somewhere, that as the arguments get weaker to be purged, they begin to look less and less like normal arguments, like reason. They lose that kind of what's the word? Strength of rigor. They might be just mildly rhetorical, you know.
It's that minimum force necessary to overcome a foe principle, which is quite a universal principle. Use the minimum force necessary. It's very, very endemic in our culture to go way too far with things. It's quite a subtle skill, that one. Minimum force to overcome a foe. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, because you don't want to make your client become addicted to the drug, and the drug here is reason. You want to weaken its force as the belief weakens, until eventually the person doesn't even take reason seriously as a method anymore, I guess.
Or their own reason in particular. That's right. Their own pathological reason, usually. Yes, that's right.
And I really like this skeptic expression, let us oppose. It's like if you were really a skeptic, you could put it on a t-shirt, couldn't you? Let us oppose. The skeptic t-shirt. But yeah, but the other thing there, I just was going to say, and then they go on to talk about the sister. It's quite a, and then you've got to read the notes at the bottom, because then there's this other view about what really happened when his sister got insulted. It goes on to page 299 there. You know, it goes on about the story about he actually did get upset on behalf of his sister, but you read down the bottom of the page and it's represented differently. Anyway, I don't think we've got time to go into that.
Yeah, that's weird. It's like a bit of a cop-out, right? Oh, I only got angry because she was defenseless.
Yeah.
Okay, number 5. A later passage remarks that we ought to subject to antithetical argument not only ethical beliefs on which contrary claims already exist, but also all those on which some counter-argument might someday arise. Skipping
Where
ahead.
are you, Courtney?
Oh, that's not 5. I saw 5 with it. I thought that was 5. It's not. It's just like that. Ignore what I'm saying.
But the other thing it ends with, though, too, is so any possible view that could create anxiety is opposed, which is preventive medicine, and only vigilance can guarantee calm. So that, again, a paradoxical idea of vigilance, tension, sort of a state of tension, of vigilance to guarantee calm, anyway.
Yeah, that's a bit silly, isn't it? Like, I thought vigilance was the enemy.
No, it's a doorway to freedom. Eternal vigilance, the price of freedom. Isn't that the American slogan?
Yeah.
I don't know. You can't avoid tension. Jesus, what?
Would you like to go on, Jody or Judy? Because my page is messed up. I scribbled all over it.
Well, I can jump in.
I'm not sure where you're up to, Courtney. I'm just scrolling through the pages
up
thinking,
to 2.
Where the hell is Courtney up to?
Page 300.
Yeah,
300.
page 300. Do you want me to just whip through a couple of pages here to get us along? Is that, yeah? So 300. Number 2, degree of skeptics' value or the end relativity, the value or end relativity. So the degree of their value or end relativity. A paradox emerges. The skeptic asserts he cannot commit to anything, with no ethical end, nor even to the belief that their procedures are productive of any good end. But the therapy points to its efficacy of achieving a very particular end, being ataraxia, which we keep saying. They argue it comes by chance, touchikos, resulting from a non-dogmatic motivation and procedure. He does not seek it out. He does not believe in it. It just happens to him. Lucky coincidence, like the painter Apelles. He is passive to it. As a Methodist doctor, experience and perception of Nikidian situation suggests to him how to proceed. And we go over to the page to 301. If she gains ataraxia and likes it, well and good. No commitment, which is liable to disturbance. So she's got no commitment, therefore she won't have any disturbance. He must have this attitude to avoid disturbance and to attain ataraxia, but ambiguity is in the very definition of skepticism. As she pointed out, you remember she wanted to pull the definition apart and tell us that there was there was ambiguity in that very first definition that she gave us. Even the pre-skeptical dogmatist is searching for the truth, to be free of disturbance. So everyone's got that same goal, haven't they, really? It is a result clause, not a purpose clause, but it does imply the verb of searching. So it implies a goal. And the dogmatic element returns when Sextus needs to proceed against an opponent who promises practical benefit, like the Stoics or the Epicureans. First, the claim that eudaimonia is equivalent to ataraxia, along with metriopathia. Secondly, the causal claim that this end is secured by the skeptic way. The examples given by Nussbaum of dogmatic passages were then listed. She's got all those dogmatic passages listed on page 301. And then mostly in the ethical section, she says, of the skeptic writings. And that brings us to 303. Do you want me to just keep going along quickly?
Yeah, you're killing it. Power on.
So Sextus must display the value. So we're on 303 now. So Sextus must display the value and point of his therapy. Otherwise, the whole enterprise is hollow and pointless. It is simpler and more habitual to be a dogmatist than a skeptic. Like, it's easier to be a dogmatist than a skeptic. Yeah, it is pretty well. We're realizing, aren't we? It's pretty hard to be a skeptic from what we've read tonight. And Nikidian needs an attachment to ataraxia, or she will go on being dogmatic after instruction. The teaching is essential. We're on 303. The teaching is essential to his function of preaching that his therapy delivers the same end. Yeah, sorry. Let me just read that again. The teaching, like the teacher, his teaching is essential to his function of preaching that his therapy delivers the same end that the competition does, but more effectively. So it must be dogmatic. The point there is that it has to be dogmatic. It is a system. The claim that this method is discovered by chance, the original pupil was already searching for ataraxia when they came to him in the first place. So even Appel liked the effect of the sponge because it was what he was aiming for. That's that point I brought up before. You know, that's what he wanted. That's what he was aiming for in the first place. So 304, the skeptic devises with care and ingenuity patterns of argument, the modes and tropes, to bring a person into equipoise about anything, and that he calibrates these arguments. Skepticism is a dunamis antitheticae, a capability whose point is to set up opposition, not simply to let it happen. One belief that will not be opposed is the belief that ataraxia is an important end, or the end. It's the end. That some people find intensity the greatest evil. But there are many others who like intensity. So we're getting to this idea that, hang on a minute, what about if you like intensity and don't mind disturbance? This is the plausible position. It was Aristotle's position. The skeptics do not mention this as this very obvious idea. They don't talk about this idea that maybe you do like to be, disturbed, that you do like intensity. The only truly fair procedure would leave Nikidian both suspended and not suspended. So Nussbaum argues that there is no value. So her statement here is that there is no value neutral procedure in ethics. That's her sweeping statement there. So Sextus can't have procedure without values, and can only conceal these by concealing the alternatives to ataraxia as an end, refusing the rivals to appear on the stage. So he's completely removing them and not even allowing the possibility of that idea to exist, that maybe someone would want to be open to disturbance. Anyway, the skeptical, and only conceal these by concealing the alternatives to ataraxia as an end, refusing the rivals to appear on the stage. The skeptic will argue that an orientation to ataraxia is not a belief or commitment, but a natural inclination. We naturally move towards freeing ourselves of burdens and disturbances. It's a natural impulse, like the dog with the thorn. Animal examples are important, like the pig eating in a storm untroubled. It is a natural instinct. I've put in my word there, instinct. Sextus says, the wise man should not be called self-controlled, since, hang on, this is interesting. Sextus says, the wise man should not be called self-controlled, since that over which he would need to exercise control does not arise in him. So he's saying, oh, well, you know, the wise man's not going to need self-control anyway. He's not going to be tempted. So he brings up the idea of the eunuch. Like, the eunuch's not going to look for sexual gratification because he won't feel like it. The same as someone that's got a stomach upset is not going to be hungry for dinner. So that would be like the wise man. He hasn't got any desire for.
I guess that's a comment against the idea of having virtue as an end, because one doesn't need virtue because one just doesn't have the desire for these.
But you have to be wise. You've got to be a wise man. You've got to be a wise person to be in that state.
Yeah, I'm a wise person.
So the bottom line is, it's a mystic tradition that's got a resentment against rationality and structure. Wouldn't that be the bottom line position of the skeptics, isn't it? They're just trying to go with this magical thinking, whatever. That's a bit derogatory, but it's a mystical idea that there's an unfathomed, unquantifiable presence in people that rational and structured belief systems will interfere with. Would that be a reasonable statement, conclusion?
I don't know, but one thing that really grabs my attention, not to change the topic, I think it's related, is that all of this talk about castration, for example, as opposed to, say, using reason to learn how to operate properly in the world, is the equivalent in modern psychiatric terms of using a medical drug to turn off parts of your brain, or have a lobotomy, for example. So that you won't actually have these desires in the first place, and then you'll achieve ataraxia. So you could imagine the lobotomized patient who is not disturbed. They're in and he's equating this kind of undisturbed state with eudaimonia. Whereas the Stoics would never make that mistake. They would never say the undisturbed life is equivalent to the good life.
That's right. Absolutely.
All right. And I'll belt
unexamined life is not worth living.
I'll try and get through these other 4 to 10. So Sextus's arguments focus on Nikidian's individual health, and philia is not a component part of that end. Philia. So
so that's kind of love and friendship, really. It's kind of a general term, yeah.
Oh, general term for love and friendship.
So and connection also, with others, right?
Yeah. Also no communal aspect. So no, so she could heal herself if she learns the knack. Her teacher just goes on in the way things strike him, committed to his own end, not hers, and she has no effective bonds to a community, you know. So so it's not bringing out, it's her individual health. It's not her the communal aspect.
And I just want to go back to that original statement where I was saying something about people who are interested in Eastern mysticism or whatever. I have a friend who I have this ongoing debate with, and he's like, why would you want to help people in the world anyway? Because he says he's practicing Vedanta or whatever. And he says that it's pointless to help other people. In fact, you know, you might as well just focus on yourself, heal yourself in a way, just you know, get to this undisturbed state. And really, it's unimportant whether you help people or not, because it's all an illusion anyway, basically. And I think that's kind of the problem that comes out of this sort of way of thinking, as opposed to one that's, you know, like the rest of these Hellenistic philosophies, maybe not Epicureanism, but it's grounded in community and coming to an idea that care for the self is care for the other simultaneously.
Absolutely. Well, there does need to be some awareness of like rescuing behavior and the idea of that meta and a lot of that Eastern ideals, people will sort of go a bit off track thinking it's all about other people when really it's about them. You know, you need to acknowledge that. There's a lot of that goes on. There is a lot of that going on. And you just think, is this really about other people? You know, virtue signaling, rescuing behavior, like
I love it.
maybe,
Yeah.
yeah, primary and secondary. You just got to primarily, it is about you and it is about your presence, but then it has to be a contribution to the common weal, you know, the commonwealth, the common good, for it to have the right context. Otherwise it gets too brutal and selfish and
Compassion. Yeah, that was funny, Shannon. Shannon just put up a comment saying, well, the community, you'd have to prove that it exists.
How can we possibly know?
That's hilarious. All right, I better keep going. We've got to get through these last few. 5 and 6. Reason and reason's virtues. This is page 307. So we're on to 5 and 6. Reason and reason's virtues are purely instrumental. So the aim is the complete paralysis of rational commitment by reason itself. The process of arguing is a drug that must expel itself along with the bad bodily humours. Like you were saying before here, Courtney, you have to expel it as well as the belief. So the process is expelled as well, and be left with only the uncommitted use of reason that is part of the observances of life. The virtues of reason treated in an ad hoc way as instrumental in countering what is in the pupil's soul. The premises of opposing arguments should be chosen not for their truth, but for their acceptability to the interlocutor. Persuasiveness replaces logical validity, even if logical sins are committed. It sounds like an ad for sophism, doesn't it? The central task is to ridicule and subvert, to subvert inference and proof. The skeptic never opposes the principle of non-contradiction. That contradictory claims cannot that contradictory claims cannot be true together. That's what it means, isn't it? The non-contradiction, the principle of non-contradiction is that contradictory claims cannot be true together. So that's something the skeptics can hold as an important part of their process. Contradictions seem not susceptible of resolution. It is a fundamental psychological principle. 308 we're on. The skeptic assents in a non-epistemic way, accepting the principle's authority, not that it is justified by the way things are. The skeptic assents in a non-epistemic way, accepting the principle's authority.
Yeah, so everything that he wants to hang on to, he turns into these sort of psychological principles that just make life the way it is, because that's the way human beings do things naturally, if you like. And he makes the law of non-contradiction one of those things, which is peculiar. Yeah. He obviously has to, because obviously I think the law of non-contradiction would have to be something like a thing cannot be true and not true at the same time, right? And we do need to have certain principles in order to conduct our affairs in the world, you know, otherwise we just wouldn't be able to work in reality, pretty much.
Postmodern nightmare, wouldn't
it? Definitely. Well, you wouldn't, and this again, going back to the Methodist doctor and modern psychology. I once read Stollerow and Atwood's book on the subject. They talk about from this sort of skeptical kind of perspective, what happens to a schizophrenic client when they confuse the internal world of the self with the external world out there, and they lose that ability to distinguish between the two. There's a very deep psychological breakdown that causes the person to think that things happening in the world are things happening within them. And that's the kind of thing that causes great psychological disturbance. So I mean, there's room here to believe that non-contradiction is actually something. There are things that we must believe if we're to make sense of the world in some sort of fundamental way.
Judy, do you want
Yes.
to bring it home? Do you want to finish the whatever else you can dig out of this
Okay.
from 7 till 10 and beyond?
I'm kind of flagging, but I'll do my
I don't
best.
mind. I'll keep going.
No, that's all right. I'll leave it with me. So from 7, yeah. So I think it's partly because she's got this. She's got her structure set up about the asymmetry of roles and the role of the teacher and so on. And I think that's where she's got to put in this section about the skeptic teacher isn't very likely to lay claim to a specific knowledge, obviously. If the skeptics act as doctors, is just because it naturally occurs to them to do so. Naturally is doing a lot of work for the skeptics here, isn't it? But skepticism is a knack and anyone can learn it. Okay, so that's the teaching aspect. So on page 309, section 8. And we've come a long way from Aristotle and his dialectical reasoning. When a view comes forward, it will not be investigated as to its motivations in human experience, as to its weight, its degree of practical truth, its relation to well-established beliefs and intuitions. It will be scanned only to ascertain the nature and degree of its power over the pupil. And then it will be tossed into the contradiction mill like everything else. So this is the procedure. Nikidian must be taught the uselessness and the impotence of belief before she'll be ready to leave her old dogmatic ways behind. So 9 and 10. Aristotle's arguments expressed respect for argument, but gestured towards their own incompleteness out of respect for particulars and the judgments of its person. Epicurus's arguments praise their own completeness and their sufficiency for human God living. So what's Nikidian's attitude to the skeptical procedure going to be? Well, she's not going to have faith in it. She will not reject it or hold it to be false, for that too will be dogmatism. And at the end of page 309, we have Sextus again. We must grasp the fact that as to their being true, we make no assertion at all. Pantos ou dia bebaiumatha, that's a tricky one, inasmuch as we say that they are capable of being confuted by themselves, seeing that they themselves are inscribed together with the things of which they are said, just as purgative drugs do not only take away the humours from the body, but eliminate themselves too, along with the humours. So it's like this self-destructive aspect to the skeptic arguments, that they destroy the dogmatism along the way, and then ultimately they destroy themselves. So yeah, Sextus underlines the point. Just as fire, having destroyed the fuel, destroys itself, it just disappears, and purgative drugs, having driven the fluids out of the bodies, remove themselves as well. So the argument against proof both abolishes every proof and also inscribes itself together with them. Sum perigraphen. And he gives the interesting metaphor of the person who's got to on top of the roof via a ladder and then kicks the ladder away.
Yeah.
So, on the other hand, that still leaves him on the roof without a ladder to get down. I'm not sure that that's quite what he needs to show. But anyway, the skeptics like this image of the purgative. And so then we find ourselves on page 311. So strictly speaking, skeptical argument opposes only that which has been asserted and believed, and the skeptic tells us he asserts nothing. So we have this rather fundamental contradiction at the heart of the whole procedure. So to conclude, it's all in the attitude of the student. Properly received, these arguments or these methods or these approaches need not struggle against themselves. They need only slide along out of the mind, not pausing to lodge there. And so we get to the final section, can Nikidian live like this? Courtney, why don't you bring it home?
Well, I made a lot of scribbly notes, but basically a bit that jumps out to me halfway down 312 is it says, Pyrrho talks of altogether divesting ourselves of the human being. Sextus describes a skeptic as a eunuch with respect to rational desires. I mean, I don't know, just from what we've read, I think talking about it with you guys made me less impressed with it, actually. I mean, it does some really interesting things from a therapeutic point of view, and I think that's what it intends to do. It's not interested in epistemic kind of knowledge. It's interested in a psychological treatment that puts removal of all disturbance at the top of its priorities. The rest of it's sort of irrelevant. And the way it targets its opponents is by taking out any other possibility for an end other than just that goal, ataraxia.
It's pretty Gestalt, really, isn't it? It's sort of links in with Gestalt ideals a bit.
So I'm kind of happy to wrap it up there, unless there's anything you want to say about the last chapter. Otherwise, we can sort of make your final closing points. Oh, and thanks for indulging me. Sorry, I know I go on a little bit. I just found that chapter really interesting. So thanks.
It is. It's a fascinating chapter. It's great. I probably sounded very critical, but there was a lot in it that I was really worthy of cogitating over.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. Yeah, I notice. I tend to go on. I'm very dogmatic.
I've never heard you go on a rant before at all. I feel like maybe we can probably set our watches to it. It's like every 30 minutes, Courtney is going to have like a bit of a dialogue with himself. Otherwise, his head will explode.
I feel, when people say Hitler was a bit like that, he kind of was this quiet person and then he'd get himself worked up. Sometimes I hear that and I go, yeah, I know what that feels like. But I haven't murdered 9 million people yet, so.
You're still young. You've got time.
He had his pluses. Went a bit
Sorry,
far.
having a winter thunderstorm here. This is really weird. So just on page 313, I thought it was really, interesting. We get these little tiny glimpses of actual life. Pyrrho living with his sister and washing a pig. It's like, oh, okay. And so it seems like he kind of lived a fairly, normal, semi-normal life with all his unusual beliefs. And what's not clear is whether this is before or after he accompanied Alexander to the east. I don't know. It's like, what would it be like after you went with Alexander to the east and had that incredible adventure and then came home and just lived with your sister and washed pigs? I don't know.
And the strange thing about that story too is he's not being ordinary, because they're saying, well, it would have been inappropriate to do the housework and wash pigs for a man. The slaves should be doing that. Well, yeah.
I like the way it goes on for 313. Nikidian will be calm and gentle. That's stress, gentility, calm and gentle, composed, good-tempered, tolerant, keeps to herself, lets others go their own way, not a slave to social prejudice, crossing class and gender boundaries, all those sort of very open-minded sort of ways of living, which are really lovely. They no longer risk their lives, but they no longer risk their lives for justice or endure hardship for loved ones, was the counter argument there. It's all per chance. So she uses the term laid back, sort of not uptight attitude to helping others. When Anaxarchus fell in the slough, Pyrrho walked past him without helping, and Anaxarchus praised him for his indifference.
Yeah, and I wonder if that was on the expedition, because they were both on it together, along with, I think, 2 other philosophers. One of them was a Aristotelian, and I can't remember who. And the other one was a cynic, I think. There were no, whether that's right, Stoicism didn't really exist then, but yeah. So there was one Aristotelian, 1 cynic, and 2 skeptics. It's like a joke, right?
They walked into a bar.
That's right. They walked into an Eastern kingdom. What happened? But yeah, that was an interesting little anecdote, wasn't it? Yeah.
And the last bit about who's Timon? Who's Timon in the garden?
Well, I think he's best known as a subject of one of Shakespeare's plays, Time of Athens. And so he was a notorious kind of misanthrope, anti-people person.
Was.
Yeah. So, and that was kind of countercultural.
And we get Candide brought up, you know, about the reference to the garden, you know, but then again, it's a slightly different reference in terms of, you know, it's a different metaphor. But we're meant to it's meant to be a metaphor for purging of belief and ridding of aggressiveness, intolerance, cruelty, and greed.
There's a little last line on this page on the Pyrrhic thing here. It says, to recapitulate, if we were to remain true to the effort of not being dogmatic, we would find it useful to posit that some certainty can be found, even though it may not be definitive. Hence, the suggestion of assuming that objectivity consists of proximate and ultimate states. I guess proximate and ultimate states just means they're fluid, does it? No, our proximate states would be fluid, and ultimate states means there are fixed things. There are ideas, and I guess it's just saying that real objectivity, if we want to be, if that's what they're really going for, it would be admitting that there are some ultimate states, but there is also proximate states. Maybe, I don't know. Do you think that's what they're really trying to get, or do you think they're just trying to destroy any ultimate state ideology? I guess they are really, aren't they?
I think, like the skeptics would say, we'd better wrap it up because it's getting late.
Yeah.
Not that I actually know what the time is.
Yeah, no,
because,
it's 10 past. Yeah.
well, that's a belief. I mean,
Is it?
but anyway, it was really good seeing you guys, and we better end it, otherwise we'll never get to bed. But thank you for participating again, and nice to see you again, Johnny.
Yeah, it was good.
Yeah, Johnny.
I learned
Good to
a
see you.
lot. It was very
Hey.
instructive, very good.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
And we'll
All
see
right,
you
see you,
guys
everyone.
on
Yeah.
Saturday. Bye bye.
See you, Shannon. See you, Judy. See you, Courtney.
Sure.
Courtney.